I'm Keith Ford, I'm president of State Center Federation of Teachers. I'm really pleased and proud to be part of the Empowerment Institute, that our union is part of the Empowerment Institute. This kind of work, social justice work, change, takes warriors, right? It's a grind. It's a day-to-day thing, and I'm showing my bias here, but we teachers know this very well, right? We get up every day and fight for our students to make the world better. And I'm not going to take up too much time because these are two of my favorite warriors. Karla Kirk,
Yes.
who was past president of the Academic Senate here at FCC. We got to work very closely together and became good friends. She's one of my favorite people. She got me into the African American Studies department, which was great, because I got to introduce myself to a room full of mostly young African American kids and say, yes, I know I'm white, and I'm going to try to be as faithful and honest to this as I can, and Karla trusted me with that, so I really appreciate you. And I always appreciate her wisdom and counsel. And then this guy, Paul Gilmore, Member Rights Vice President for Fresno City College, and longtime Executive Council member with me. Before that, he was my Executive VP. There are very few people I trust more in the world than him, and I hope that you really enjoy what they have to share with you. Thank you very much.
So we're on Zoom, so I'm using this, but I think well, let me know if I yell too much as we go through this. But I think when Karla and I were talking about how we wanted to do this, we wanted to start with just a kind of taking the temperature of the room kind of discussion as to what you all are coming with. I mean, what you're coming to this room with, what kind of things you know about the civil rights movement, what kinds of things do you know about the history of the labor movement, maybe how they're connected. And so we just thought we would start out with a kind of going around and you know, what are the main figures and events in the civil rights movement that you kind of remember from perhaps your high school history class or something like that. Go. Okay, King, Martin Luther King Jr. Yeah, he's sort of, well, I guess he kind of overshadows most of our childhood educations, that's for sure. Rustin. Yeah, and sometimes, well, a used to be vetoed from history person. I'm enjoying the movies that have come out lately, even if I don't like the movies, because at least they bring people's names to the fore, right? So by Rustin, a behind-the-scenes guy. There's a great documentary about him before the movie called Brother Outsider. Did you want to add some comments about these things, or are we?
I don't want to spoil the PowerPoint.
Oh no, of course not. All right. Yeah. Dan.
What does it mean that King was assassinated at a sanitation workers while he's beginning to organize workers? And as he turned to begin to talk about economic justice issues and anti-war work, you know, more beyond the civil rights, he was turning into even more difficult terrain, and then is assassinated.
Yeah, I think by the end of today, we'll talk a bit about that. You know, about the challenges that that King, but lots of others were raising to the entire economic and social order of America.
Well, my research.
Dan was in my civil rights class, by
Yeah,
the way.
and
Just so
also your labor business history class. But my research for my thesis tells revealed an interesting story about how the Black civil rights movement intersected with the farm worker movement during the 1960s because SNCC was very much involved with the United Farm Worker Union movement during the Delano Great Strike and the March on Sacramento and whatnot. So there's this crossover.
Yeah, we're going to talk a bit about that, about the coalition building, and then walls to coalition building a little bit as well. Yeah.
I think it's really important to recognize what is often unsung or misrepresented work of women in the movement, and also that much of what the movement was engaged in, while also being about people, were labor issues. So the Montgomery bus boycott is both an attempt to get the buses, but it's an attempt to get the buses so workers can get to work, you know? And so I think that it's really important to frame a lot of what we think of the movement. And then I just want to give a shout out to Rosa Parks, who was an NAACP organizer on sexual assault issues well before we know her as sitting on that bus.
Yeah, I'm hoping that both of us can introduce to some folks a kind of underground, or what we usually think of as an underground or sort of forgotten stories of the civil rights movement. You know, we get the general story that gets sort of laid out there, but then one of the great things about the civil rights movement and the labor movement is that this is more than other things in history, more than other topics in history. We can talk about ordinary people. Karla, did you want to take over and maybe?
Field questions?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Well, I just, one of the things that, like, I had never heard, and I grew up here and I went to three colleges, was that the KKK was pretty active here and being anti-labor.
Yes.
And so as like a white woman with that in my family, I was like, why? Nobody told us. And so we found out in the library, and it was like, oh shit, there's my family name, you know, and then, so we got like that, I had only found that reference in one article in one instance in 1934, where it's actually been published, and then everywhere else it's just been like oral stories in our research. And so I think that in this area needs to be, I mean, is that, I don't know yet, but.
Yes, I think an important part of that is why didn't anyone tell you that? And when I talk a little bit about the great migration of African American people leaving the South to go to the North, they also came to the West.
Right.
But before they got here, some other folks from the South had also migrated here and brought some of that culture here to the Central Valley. So that as black folks are coming across the country to flee Jim Crow, they're coming into cities where it's already set up, again, for them, not in law, but in practice. So yes, I think revealing that fuller history is so important to our younger generation so that we don't carry forth those lies and that inability to understand that we don't live in a vacuum and that the things that we're experiencing today have roots that go back very far in our country and seem to follow us around wherever we go to try and get away from them. Yes, sir?
Tom Hayden, Jane Fonda, Black Panthers up in the Bay Area. And the reason I know those names is they sat in my living room. My dad did his doctoral thesis, believe it or not, in criminal justice. He testified in the Chicago 8 trial because he had the shit beat out of him by Chicago PD. He was there, ironically, researching civil justice and large national events and the law enforcement's relationship to that. So the irony of that is he testified in Chicago 7 against Chicago PD. His last consulting job was for Chicago PD. So.
I'll look this way. Anyone this way?
I think the many Supreme Court decisions and litigations that were decided, and I think that shaped a lot of the civil rights and the labor movement. Plessy versus Ferguson, Scott, Hernandez versus Texas.
They laid the foundation for laws that seemingly had to be passed again, even though they were kind of already on the books.
it's one of the big things for me at least is the connection between social movements and more traditional electoral politics, and where is the lever that a social movement can pull that will make some sort of change at that electoral political level. So I think we're probably going to get into all of this kind of stuff, aren't we?
I think so.
Would you like to start, or do you
I
want
think
to?
I'm first, unless there are any other questions or comments or anything else you want to share. All right, then I'm going to DJ up here and
I'm going
switch
to just
this
sit
to-
down.
Oh, where's the magic clicker? I know, you're protecting it.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm gonna assume that folks on Zoom, I'm glad they gave me the mic, because I don't really like to stand behind a podium and talk. I'm happy to shout at all of you, but I want to make sure that our folks on Zoom can hear us too. So what I am here to do, Professor Gilmore is the absolute expert in union and labor. I am not going to pretend that I have particular expertise in this area. While they love to tell me the titles that I used to have, I don't like to talk about Senate too much anymore. I'm still kind of trying to get over it. My real job here is to teach African American studies. It is a pleasure and a privilege to teach in a program that is one of the oldest African American studies programs in the state of California. I inherited a wonderful program from Kayebe Sawalzi, who spent 45 years building this program. I was one of his students, and he said, "Do you want to teach this?" And I said, "Sure." So we came through, he mentored me through the program to make sure that this program that is so historic and so important to this community was in good hands with someone who's from this community. I know we love getting folks from other regions, but sometimes homegrown talent is a great thing too. What I'm here to do today, before Professor Gilmore gets more to the union and labor movement, is to provide some historical context. I feel like I have to remind people sometimes, I too am a history teacher. I think they think I came through a different area. I came right through history. History is my foundation. It's how I teach my courses. So what I'm going to do for you today, I tried to take some of the words off, is you are not having a test. So I don't. If you want to take a picture of the screen, give me a second to pose. I'm going to take pictures of the notes. But I'm going to spend some time today providing some historical context about African American culture and what is leading up to the civil rights movement that we know about in the 60s. That was, like I said before, not something that happened in a vacuum, but actually has deeper historical roots in who we are as an American society. I'm a teacher, I can't help but give you topics. It's like ingrained in me, is always my second slide, are the things that we're going to talk about. Just so you can kind of see the order, and maybe look at how far back we're going when we talk about civil rights. I'm going to talk a little bit about civil rights and human rights, and how those two intersect, but how they can also be a divide in how movements move forward. All right, let's get started. So the civil rights movement, as we know it, comes from the African American struggle for civil rights and human rights in this country that date back to the African experience here in the United States. So what we look at is what the civil rights movement and the abolition movement and the fight against Jim Crow, all the way back to the end of slavery. Not emancipation. I feel like I'll take this moment. I know we just celebrated his birthday. But Abraham Lincoln did not free enslaved Africans with the Emancipation Proclamation. What he did was say people who were in the Union States were no longer enslaved people, but the people who were in the Confederate States remained under slavery. So the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery, but outlawed slavery in the states that had kind of already outlawed it. But that's okay. I'm not going to take away from his glory. We just had a wonderful furniture sale in his name. So when we look at the end of slavery, which is going to come in 1866, at the end of the Civil War, the end of slavery with that passing of the 13th Amendment, except for that tricky little part at the end that we're not going to get into today, but that tricky little part that says that unless you're convicted of a crime. So when we're looking at African American people coming out of this institution of enslavement and moving in, some of the factors, the things that they were all reaching for. I'm going to go ahead and let this person in. There you go. Let them in too. You probably couldn't see that. I could see that online. There was someone in the waiting room. That when we look at these goals of what African American people had at the end of slavery in this country, that we see resonance in the things that the Black Lives Matter is pushing for today. And it almost seems like since 1866, We could have addressed some of these before we got here to 2024, when some of these are still our core social issues when you're dealing not just with the African American community, but with communities of color. But originally, in this country, there was a binary choice between black and white. And the systems that were built for black and white people. So when we look at some of these goals, this idea of reclaiming identity, African people were stripped of their African identity. That was replaced with a slave identity that denied them any connection to history beyond the institution of slavery in this country. So reclaiming that identity of humanness, of being a real people, and not just a product in this country was one of the #1 goals. And in doing that, one of the most significant things that was done was that reconnection of family. Because during the era of enslavement, your family unit was not safe. Your children could be sold from you. Your spouse could be sold from you. Your spouse could be killed. And so the reconnection of that family was one of the primary goals, and still today is one of the things that holds our African American community together. Issues of social justice, of civil rights and human rights, and we're going to look at kind of how those compare to each other. When we're looking at civil rights, the rights that are due to us as citizens of a nation, and human rights, rights that are due to us because we are human beings on this planet. All of us are all the same type of human being on this planet. I like to tell my students, we like to divide into races. There is currently just one human race, unless the X-Men are among us and are keeping themselves secret. We are genetically all the same modern human that left Africa 120,000 years ago. And while we have some physiological differences based on where our ancestors settled on the planet, that shaped our hair type, that shaped our skin color, that shaped features like our noses, besides those things, we are still genetically a human race. And that all of us are entitled to some basic human rights as the primary species on this planet that gets to boss around everything. Equal treatment under the law and protection from violence, those are going to be at the core of what is going to become the civil rights movement. What are we entitled to as citizens of this country, and what are we entitled to as human beings? Oh, I thought I was going to be slick with that.
Oh, click back into the slide, that's what it is. When you let the person into the Zoom, it's probably what happened.
Okay,
See if it works now?
there we go.
Okay, all right.
Thank you, Steve. So when we look at civil rights, rights that are guaranteed to us as citizens of this country, or the country that you live in, as a citizen, you're entitled to some of these basic rights. The rights that are protected under our federal constitution, the rights that are afforded to you for the state that you live in, some of the rights that we enjoy because of the county that we live in. These are rights based on your citizenship. The right to vote, the right to assemble, the right to form unions. These are things that are entitled to us as citizens of this country, citizens of this state, citizens of this county. When we talk about the electoral process, this is where we have direct input into how our cities, our states, and our nation build a structure around us that protects us. Those rights are enumerated in the Constitution. They're rights that we know about. I heard that they don't give that Constitution test anymore. Have you heard this? Oh my gosh, I thought I was going to melt my brains trying to learn the preamble by heart so I could write it down on this test. Understanding how the Constitution came together. I feel like this is so important and should be something that we reinforce for our children, kind of like writing in cursive. If they can't write in cursive, they can't read in cursive, and then they can't read some of our historical documents that are written in cursive. Why don't we want them to know that? So those civil rights are those rights that are granted to us as citizens of this nation. So in the African American experience, those civil rights are not going to be granted until African Americans are seen as citizens in this country with the passing of the 14th Amendment. That is going to give you birthright citizenship to this country, and therefore, theoretically, access to the civil rights that are afforded every American citizen. So at the heart of the civil rights movement, these are the issues that we're going to be looking at, but there is a movement that is going alongside of that as far back as the civil rights movement, and that is the push for human rights, especially for African Americans coming out of the issue of, institution of enslavement, where they were not seen as humans. where they were seen as chattel, as property, as commodities. So what are our basic human rights outside of the rights that were granted because we're citizens of a country? But what are our human rights? Our rights to self-governance. Our rights to a system of justice because we're humans and we are entitled to a system of justice. The right of self-reliance, to choose where you work, how you work, how you use your labor to benefit yourself and your family and your community. As humans, we have the right to be educated. No one should keep knowledge from you, and if they're trying to keep knowledge from you, a good question is why? Why don't you want us to know this? There's a simple question, I think my students have got it by now. Dumb people are easy to control. So they keep this knowledge from you, so you don't know, and then they control how you think about things because you don't know any better. And the great ancestor Maya Angelou said, when you know better, you do better. That's why education is fundamental. It is a basic human right. We don't need dumb people walking around this planet.
Thank you, amen.
The right to human services. As a human being, you have the right to food. No one in this valley should be hungry.
Thank you.
We grow 80% of the food for the rest of the country. Our kids should not be eating hot Cheetos all day. We have the right to shelter. In a country this big, with resources so abundant, why do we have people who don't have something as simple as a place to call home? And then healthcare. Healthcare is not a privilege. Healthcare is a right. As a human being, you have the right to be healthy. You should not suffer an illness because you can't afford the treatment to fix your illness. That is not something that we should leave to the privileged class. Healthcare is a right, shelter is a right, food is a right that we are entitled to as human beings. So beyond the nation that you live in, beyond your citizenship status, these are things that as humans, we need to ensure for our fellow humans. I want to lay the foundation for those two. Any questions about that? All right. How far back does the civil rights movement go? Very far back. Beyond human rights, which is going to be an argument that we're going to have later, the first idea is what do we do with African people at the time of emancipation, at the time of the end of slavery, at the abolition of slavery. The question for this country to face, it was called the Negro problem. What do we do with all of these people who used to be property, but are now American citizens? So what we're going to see, there was always kind of a duality of what was best for the African American population at the end of enslavement. So we have Frederick Douglass, someone you're familiar with, I'm sure, who said that not only do African people living in America, not yet African Americans, African people have the right to be free, and then should, as builders of this nation, integrate into this nation and begin to reap the benefits of American citizenship and the growing of American wealth. The establishment of American wealth that was built on black labor. Uncompensated, unrecognized labor that built the wealth of this country. Frederick Douglass said that we should begin to enjoy the benefits of the work that our ancestors have done to build up this country, that we should too join into this American family. Someone you may not have heard so much about, Martin R. Delaney, at the same time, comes from a different, Frederick Douglass comes from the era of enslavement. He comes from slavery. It was the context in which he was raised, and when his discussion about that is always in the context of what do we need to do to be accepted in this country. Martin R. Delaney comes from a different background. He comes from an intellectual background, an educated background, who saw what he thought was a folly in the America's ability to ever accept black people as fully human, let alone fully citizens. And Martin R. Delaney's idea was, we actually need to get out of the United States and begin to establish our own colonies, our own cities, our own nation. Because in a nation that is built on the oppression and dehumanization of our people is never going to fully see us as human or citizen. So we have kind of a dueling ideals of what is best for African Americans after the end of slavery. Do we stay and continue to build and integrate in and reap the benefits of being an American citizen if they'll give it to us? Or do we take our skills, our knowledge, and our abilities and begin to build our own nations outside of the oppressive system that the United States is built on? Any questions? I know I'm gonna move through quick because I'll be up here like Professor Gilmore for 2 hours. And I can talk about this stuff all day. I tried to limit my slides because I talk about this, it'll be 3 o'clock in the afternoon and you won't have had a break. So I'm going to move quickly because I do have a couple of video clips because there are some things that the experts can talk about more better than I can paraphrase. So we're going to get, I'm going to move it along. All right. The Great Migration. Is anyone familiar with this term? Has anyone read the book by Isabel Wilkerson? Oh, you have homework. This is a wonderful book that follows the stories of 4 African American people leaving the South, leaving Jim Crow, the system of Jim Crow, the system of segregation, the system of racial violence that was so prevalent in the southern states, the former Confederate states, what we call the South. I know it's kind of weird because when we say South, and we mean LA. People say the North, and I think the Bay Area, but you know, contextually across the country. Leaving racial violence, racial segregation, racialized oppression in the South for opportunities that were opening up in what we call the North, but to me it's really back east. That's all back east to me. So in those northern states after World War I, jobs are going to begin to open up in those industrial eras, and African American people in a movement of protest are going to choose to leave the South and begin to rebuild their lives, their economic opportunities, their educational opportunities, opportunities for their future generations by going up to the north and then over here to the west. So I have a little clip that I'm going to show from Isabel Wilkerson, who does, I don't want to paraphrase her because she does such an excellent job describing her preeminent work, which is, thank you, sir. I said I wasn't nervous, I'm just kidding. I'm sweating bullets up here a little bit. The Warmth of Other Suns. So before I show you that clip, now let me show you the clip, and then I'll tell you about these pictures that you're looking at. I'm going to ask DJ Mixmaster to come back up here and switch that back to the PowerPoint. The Jim Crow era, if you don't know, Jim Crow was the name of a caricature in vaudeville. He was a white man who put on blackface to kind of imitate some of the worst stereotypes about what was perceived as what black people were like. And so he would dance and he would shuffle and he makes eyes real big and talk funny. So that name Jim Crow became the nomenclature for segregation in the South, for racial oppression in the South. So someone had brought up Plessy versus Ferguson. Who was that? You, sir. So what we saw in this country from 1866, the end of the Civil War, to 1898 was this period called Reconstruction. There were grand goals with Reconstruction, how to rebuild not just the real infrastructure of the South that had been destroyed through war, but how do we rebuild our economic system and our social system to find space for people who had not been considered people for 300 years previous to that. So that's the system of Jim Crow. I know she was saying that a lot. I wanted to make sure that I got a little bit in there. So this case of Plessy versus Ferguson that's going to happen in 1898 is there is a, what we would call, or what was considered then a black man. He was 1/4 black, 1/4 black, who was told to sit in the colored section. This is Louisiana. That's the terminology that they used. He refused to sit in that section. He sued the railroad. It was determined that he did, because of his race, thank you, sir, have to sit on the segregated. This was the idea that you could create a separate but supposedly equal accommodation for people of African descent, no matter how much or how little of that African descent you had in you from this point on. So 1898 is really going to be the end of that time of Reconstruction. There's other stuff, You know, that's in the other history class. Other stuff that happened during Reconstruction. But that case is going to make it's going to be the first real case that said it is okay in this country to separate people by race. It's okay. We're going to start doing that. And from 1898 until we get to the end of the Civil Rights Movement and legislation that is passed, that is going to be the law of the land, that it is okay to separate people based on race, our perceived notion of race, and to make it inherently unequal. So I have these pictures up here. Dr. Wilkinson talked about this migration. Oh, I get the pointer. So the reason that I am here in Fresno, California, talking to you today, and not in Chicago, talking to some folks in Chicago or in New York or in Detroit, is because my grandparents were part of that third wave, the wave that left the South from Texas and Oklahoma and came out to California. So this image here, push the right button, that is my great-grandfather, who was a sharecropper in Oklahoma. That means he did not own his land, he worked the land. That is the truck that my 5-year-old grandfather came to California in from Oklahoma. So I don't know if you understand that there was no, there weren't like Motel 6s and stuff that you could just stop at on the way from Oklahoma to California. It's a longish drive. I have driven to Oklahoma. So it's longish drive. So what they did, and especially because they were black. So you could not stop and find accommodations in many of the places that they had to go through. And so what they did is they just took turns driving and kept driving and not stopping until they were stopped for a few days in New Mexico where they were able to stay with family because of a snowstorm. But once they got on the road again, they did not stop. The kids slept in the back of that truck and they just kept rolling until they got to California. They settled in Bakersville, where my grandfather here, we talked about how far back you have to go, how many greats do you have to go back? His father was an enslaved African person. His mother was an enslaved African person. My great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, were born into slavery and emancipated in 1866. My grandfather, I don't have a picture of him up here, I know, I'm supposed to get one of him. My grandfather turned 100 years old in November. That is living history that connects me to slavery. So who were in those fields? In my grandfather's dream, my great-grandfather's dreams, and my great-great-grandmother's dreams, who were in those fields? Professors. My grandfather is a jazz musician. Scientists, all of these folks that we have, that we would not have had this chance had they not left. In Bakersfield, my great-grandfather was allowed to purchase land. He was allowed to farm his own land. He was able to build a store and able to then educate his kids so that my grandfather, who absolutely removed us from farming, he said, no, my line will be educated, we're not going to work in the fields. So that my mom and her siblings went to college, so that me and my siblings went to college, so that my kids are in college. They created a college-going generation from a generation who was never allowed to even think about going to college. That's the power of that migration, of getting out a political protest to say we will not tolerate the inhuman treatment, the uncivil treatment, and the denial of our civil and human rights. That's my great-grandma. I'm here today because of their sacrifices to get out of that oppressive system, to find a place where we can be free to be full citizens, where we can be free in our full humanity. And it's because of that, I think you heard Dr. Wilkinson say, 90% of the black population in this country was living in the South prior to this. And so what we're going to see is wave after wave after wave after wave of folks leaving that oppressive system to try and find a better life, not just for themselves, but for the future of their generations. I think I told you at the beginning, one of those important factors that we focused on at the end of slavery was that reconnection of family and the finding of identity and establishing your own family identity outside of this construct of slavery. I should speed up. Politics of the new Negro movement. This is the movement that is coming post Plessy versus Ferguson, coming into now the 20th century, the early 20th century. Again, we're going to see two different lines of how African American people can best survive in this country, in the very harsh environment of this country. We had three lines of thought in the early 20th century coming into the 1910s and 1920s. One was Booker T. Washington. who was a segregationist. I think we are getting to a point in our country where we need to reevaluate segregation, not by law, that says I can't drink out of this drinking fountain in Clovis, to be saying, I don't want to drink out of that drinking fountain. I choose not to, a choice, not a law. Segregation provided African American communities protection from that outside society. A segregationist like Booker T. Washington says, how far away do we need to be from you for you to leave us alone? For you to let us have our own dignity, our own self-reliance, our own form of education, to educate our own folks. Booker T. Washington believed in a more practical education. The majority of African American people are coming from labor, and so how to enhance that labor to improve your community. I think one quote he said is, a white planter said, why would I send Sally to your school to learn how to cook when she can spit in the pan and tell me if it's hot? And Booker T. Washington said, we're going to teach her not to spit in the pan. So not so much of moving forward in social status, but a coming together to find really those things that are going to build a community up in strength. And as long as we're separated, like you said, separated like the hand on this finger, with things social, we can be separate, you can do your stuff, but if things of mutual concern, then we can be strong like a fist, then we can come together in movements that are going to benefit us all. That was Booker T. Washington. Let us be in our own space, doing our own thing, and we're not going to bother you. Booker T. Washington was also from a history of enslavement. He was born into slavery and was emancipated at 12. His context of understanding was different. He had seen his uncle lynched. He knew the real violence that could come by pushing at the white community for too much, because that pushback was so violent. Along the same line was W.E.B. Du Bois, who comes from a different historical context. He was born in the North. He was born a free man. He was educated not only here in the United States, but in Europe. Who said, we as a people can do more than cook and pull crops out of the ground. And that it is so important for us to focus on finding and fighting for our civil rights as citizens of this country. We have to understand our responsibilities as citizens of this country, to be educated, to be politically active, to understand our society, to fight for those rights for everyone, and to integrate, to tell me I can. You can't tell me where I can live and where I can't live, what job I can have, what job I can't have, where I can send my kids to school, who I can play checkers with. W.E.B. Du Bois said, we must fight for a higher ideal than just the safety of our own communities. And then always that undertone from Marcus Garvey that said, you know, we probably just need to get out of here. Marcus Garvey said, we need to build our own nation. We need to leave this nation that will never accept us, that will never protect us, and go and build our own. There's always going to be a thread moving through, especially in the Black community, of maybe this is not where we're supposed to be. But then that pushback, well, my great-great-great-great-grandparents are here. Why can't this be where I'm supposed to be? All right, here we go. I only got like 3 more slides. What is going to be the reform movement that grows into the civil rights movement is really going to begin to pick up steam after World War II. My grandfather, we did a really cool documentary. Luckily for you, I didn't bring the 45-minute documentary for you to watch. I'm just going to paraphrase his story because this is a story I know very well. When my grandfather was drafted into the Army at the age of 19, during what he didn't know was the end, kind of the drawing down of World War II, our army, our military was still segregated. And so in his documentary, he talks about, well, we had where the black soldiers were and where the white soldiers were. We had the black cafeteria, we had the white cafeteria. We had the white officers, no black officers. Still living in that segregated, fighting a war commonly in one military, but in 2 different, like Dr. Wilkerson talked about, we had 2 different Bibles. So we're serving in 2 different armies. There's a white army and a black army. So at the end of World War II, they are going to desegregate our military. And with the desegregation of the military, now other aspects of our government have to look at this idea of desegregation. One of the things that we don't talk about so much is these World War II vets came back with their guns. The rifles that they had to use in the military, they came back with those. That is going to make the first time really in American history where the black population is armed. You can see why this movement was going to spice up a little bit. We're going to see one of the early decisions, so that's in 1942, 1945, that's going to be really a big pickup in that migration movement out of the South. This was the first time now that black men serving in the military are getting that same kind of start with the GI Bill that paid for you to either go to college or to buy a home. Overwhelmingly in West Fresno, veterans bought homes and they built a whole little segregated area in Fresno called West Fresno. We have a beautiful new campus right in that area now. I can look out and see my grandpa's house that he had to build in that neighborhood. They built those neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods became flourishing communities. Families moved there. After the war, they brought their wives, they had children, and they built a thriving community in West Fresno. I know that might sound weird to you, because probably not too many of you go to West Fresno anymore. Ever. Have ever been there. Veterans? No, that's Northwest Fresno.
Oh,
You're talking about Southwest.
well, I'm showing my ignorance.
That's okay, no.
My
Veterans
grandmother
Boulevard is to get you all out to Marketplace, a beautiful new shopping center they built on that side of town. In the meantime, West Fresno has one grocery store. It's a Food for Less, and it is the worst Food for Less in the state of California. It's dirty, it's overpriced, and it never has enough people working there. That's the one grocery store for that entire community.
Where's the police station too?
Oh yeah, we got plenty of substations too, more substations than you can throw a stick at. So we had something that was developing, not just here in Fresno, but in communities all across the state, all across the country where these migration routes were placing citizens who are now after them, not just their human rights, but their civil rights. One of the first landmark rulings in this movement to say, we fought in this war, we have ideas of liberty and democracy, things that we fought for, things that we died for, that we can't get in our own country. That we fought and died in Germany and in France, only to be denied those same rights that we were fighting for here in our own country. This is going to be the start of this movement of coming together to say, we deserve better. We are citizens equally in this country. One of those first landmark decisions is going to be the Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education, where the Supreme Court decided that separation is inherently unequal. And the forced integration in this country, it was forced. It was not something that this country was fully ready for. We may argue this country still is not ready for full integration. I'm on the internet, I better not pick on Clovis too much. Clovis now is having to make some changes in who gets to live in Clovis and what housing they can afford and that type of thing. One of these last vestiges of this is our community and we're going to keep it our way no matter what laws we're dividing until it becomes too much, until it does become untenable and even the Clovis way of life has to change. I've had negative experiences in Clovis, and so I feel like I'm not just talking. I've had personal negative experiences in Clovis, and unless I'm required to go by my job to a meeting out there, I don't spend too much time out there. I absolutely don't spend any money there. It is my own personal form of protest. If you can't respect my humanity, you can't have a dime of my money. All right, let's speed up. Okay. So we're looking at the reform movement, trying to reform the laws of America, the laws of segregation, trying to change those to reform them. We see that with the desegregation of the school. We see these early movements still kind of regionalized in the South because we're still part of that great migration movement. What's happening during the migration movement is people who are experiencing this racial injustice, racial violence, and racial oppression in the South are leaving to places like the North and the West Coast to be faced with racial discrimination, still racial segregation. So we see that movement that is beginning primarily in the South as the reform movement with the Montgomery bus boycott, with a little Ron. My parents were in high school during that same time. And so I say, do you remember that? They're like, well, why do you know about that? And I say, well, why didn't you teach me about this? Why did I have to come to college? To learn that you were all part of this too. And then the lunch counter sit-ins that were happening in the South, as people are still migrating, those movements are getting to move to different parts of our nation. They're following these movements. This reform movement is following the same path as the migration. And as it becomes not just an isolated part of racial aggression, racial violence in the South, it's becoming a larger national movement. It's going to pick up bigger personalities. Like Dr. King, he gets all the glory. I know we want to talk about other folks who are part of the movement and the role that women play in the movement, but what I like to remind people the most is that those people who are marching, those people who are protesting, were college students. To remind our students, this is your legacy. Students led that civil rights movement. Students fought. Students sat in at those lunch counters and took those meetings. Students went out and got people registered to vote during their summer breaks. It was students. Is really the unsung hero of our civil rights movement. So I brought you up to the civil rights movement. I'm going to show you this one little one, and then I'm going to turn it over to Professor Gilmore for a little wrap-up. presentation. Are there any questions for me before I turn it over? Ms. Bowen?
In the context of your own personal history, what year did your great-grandfather settle in Bakersfield?
My great-grandfather bought the last of his kids, my grandpa is the youngest, in 1929.
Okay, and did your parents both go to high school in Bakersfield?
No, my grandfather decided that Bakersfield was not the town for him. He came up to the big city of Fresno, California, when he, after the end of World War II,
Okay.
at 20 years old, he settled here, met my grandma, married her 3 months later. They had 5 kids. We are now on to our 4th generation. 5th generation of family in Fresno.
I asked you that because I've lived in Bakersfield twice myself.
My grandpa said Bakersfield was the city for us, and we all took him serious.
And, everybody should know about Oildale if they don't.
Yeah, I know about oil. Kind of looks like Mad Max when you look over the plateau with all the
Yeah,
oil
across the
fields
ridge,
and
across the
everything.
Kern River. Yeah, anyway, I just wanted to ask this question.
Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
So just hearing your story here, I can't help but be a little infuriated. My family also is from Bakersfield, from the oil fields and taps, so I know exactly why they left.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, like knowing the history of this area and knowing that Fresno City College to this day has not renamed the baseball field, make it make sense?
I have this symbol like this. It means that's above my pay grade.
Right, so who do I need to talk to about that? I'm not joking. You can talk to
Oh,
me.
good. I didn't want to just call her out. One of our board members is here today. It's our board of trustees, and I believe they're working on it. We're education. We don't move quick in anything, but.
It's been 4 years, and if we're talking about justice, what about your justice? Do you know what I'm saying? And there's young kids that play baseball on that field.
Indeed.
And they're gonna tell me that they don't know that that's one of the 5 charter members of the Fresno KKK. Respectfully, fuck you. Do you know what I mean?
We can help by letting them know. Yes.
It's a lot. I mean, like, they're playing around right in your face.
Yeah.
So, come on.
So the name hasn't been removed yet?
No,
No,
there
no,
doesn't.
the name's been removed officially. It's just ballpark now.
Well, then why isn't there a news story about it?
It's being renamed soon.
That is maybe something we should let the community know, that we
Right,
did actually take the name down.
Because they were really upset about it, and
Yeah.
when there's an entire commission, and in that research, they do the bare minimum, and then they bury it, and there's a team of researchers that are questioning the integrity of all of that work because you didn't do a Google research, and your own board members are saying that John Lewis was allegedly affiliated with the KKK when his actual Klan application was printed in the press, and he wrote a letter and signed it and said, "Sue me, I'm the Klan."
So,
And you're gonna say that you didn't know?
what I'm gonna do, I'm not gonna throw my board member under the bus.
Do it.
I know, no, this is what I would
You know
recommend.
what I mean, and don't be in a social.
If it's not being
justice.
talked about enough, I highly recommend you go to the board meeting and during the open forum.
I would, but
Express-
I've been arrested twice. Right. Once at the library, 15 officers and 5 undercovers, and I got injured.
Whoa.
Right.
Struggle,
I'm happy to talk with you about it and make sure that some action gets taken
Good, well,
in a public way about the need,
perfect.
because it is.
It is, it is. Thank you.
Well, and thank you for bringing it up in a community of people who have no idea what you're talking about, because we don't pay attention to local news, so I'm clueless.
That's on purpose though, you guys. That's on purpose. That's what they do. That's what the KKK here does. Is they fuck around right in your face, and they've been doing it for 100 years, and it's really unfair. Sorry for that.
That's okay. That's okay. I look over this side. Any questions? Yes, yes, ma'am.
I don't really have a question, I just want to compliment you, that was a really great run through.
Oh, thank you.
A lot of history and it was really well put together.
I was wondering if you mentioned West Fresno, I was wondering if you might be able to say a little bit more about its trajectory from that point that you mentioned it to today.
From the, I know I'm old, but I wasn't around in the 50s. West Fresno, when I was a kid, I will tell you, when I was a kid in the late 70s and early 80s, it was a much different community than what you see today. As a 4-year-old, I was able to walk 3 blocks to a store called Lee's. Gaston is there now, but there used to be a store there called Lee's. My grandparents lived on the other side of the Carver Basin. My grandpa calls it Lake Carver and his lakefront property. But I would be able to go from that, through a neighborhood that was called the U in the 90s and seen as a dangerous place, to walk from my grandparents' house through Eugenia neighborhood to Lee's Market at 4 years old. Because I was going to pass 8 houses where people knew who I was. There was a safety in that. There was a protection in that. I remember a ton of buildings in West Fresno as a kid that are just no longer there. There's just empty spaces now. And so what happened is, as a response to the civil rights movement as it occurred here in Fresno, there was a kind of a secret destruction in West Fresno. So that the businesses were closed, the buildings were destroyed, now they're just empty lots. The stores, the industries that were there as a segregated community that had to build up everything on its own, all of that disappeared by 1989. Yes, ma'am.
I'm so sorry, because we've been researching this at the downtown library. The plan burned it.
Yeah.
They did. They set fires there, and there's like this one property on C Street where you guys, it's in the newspaper, and they said that the Negro was peacefully sleeping and didn't hear the fire alarm. And then the firefighters allegedly, and this is a legend because I haven't interviewed any firefighters, but they did this on purpose all the time. And they acted like they couldn't hear them.
Yeah.
And they let them burn.
So all of the structures, the community, they had dance halls, there was a racetrack, Kearney Bowl was over there, all of this great stuff was over there. And by the time I got to high school in 1990, it was gone. And it had been replaced with a lot of guns that had come into our community,
What happened in
crack
the 90s?
cocaine that was flown in through Chandler Airport that
Right.
infested my neighborhood. Everything changed. By 1995, it was a completely different place. And
Right.
now all my family, except me, I'm still 93706 all my life. Until my family, for the most part, really moved over to the north side of town, leaving my grandpa. So me and my parents, we stayed in West Fresno because that's where our roots are. Yes?
I was gonna say, I grew up here. I was a kid in the 50s and 60s, and it was a totally different place.
Yeah.
Chinatown was
Yeah.
vibrant. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, Chinatown is mostly vacant lots now, and I can remember the restaurants and the bars, the clubs.
Absolutely.
There is that whole
My grandfather was a
separate
jazz
world.
musician, and so he played at a lot of those clubs at night. He was a mailman during the day because he had 5 kids that he had to support. But then at night, he was a jazz musician. He had his own jazz band, and they played in all of those places.
Yeah, it was a totally, and when Ed Cashin wanted to turn Chinatown into River Park, he had his eye on Highway City. At the same time, rebuilt it.
Yeah.
He was gonna remake Chinatown, and it never came to
That was kind of the
fruition.
start of all of the development moving north.
Yeah.
So we kind of, here in the southwest part of town, like the slide from a snail, as the snail moved to the north side of
Yeah.
town, and we're left kind of in the wake of the destruction of that.
But I could tell stories about growing up here in the 50s and 60s.
They're probably easier to get out of either. My parents act like they don't want to talk about this stuff. Yes, sir.
Just a quick one, no doubt the bifurcation of 06 and 21 was accelerated in the 1960s by the building of the freeway.
And don't forget, 180 took out a bunch of neighborhoods too.
Yeah.
A lot of folks lost their house with the extension of 180 out to Raleigh.
On purpose.
On purpose, absolutely. Eminent domain of some folks in my family. Yeah. I see Paul with the microphone. He's about to give me the wrap it up.
Well, no. No, I like this whole discussion because it's a really good kind of segue between the story of, that we sometimes treat as separate, the story of racial justice and economic justice. And you can see in this so-called economic development story, a story of racial injustice, and maybe economic injustice. And I think what we need to do now, though, is take, I think we're scheduled for a break for 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and begin to tell that other part of the story. But it'd be great to have another round of applause. Well, I wanted to thank everybody for coming This is really nice, and I'm hoping that, thanks to Karla for her presentation. I thought that was wonderful. And we didn't really talk terribly much about exactly what each of us is going to say, but But the thing that I want to do is try to weave some of, I'm hoping you'll see how her story and the story I'm going to tell are woven together. The difficult thing for me was to try to figure out what to leave in and what to leave out. You know, there's like 10,000 things that I want to talk about, so what I did is I just put them all in there. And I'm just going to talk really fast. No, I'm trying to focus on a few big things, but I'm hoping that today I can give you a little bit of food for thought about the connections between, I hate to say different movements, but different movements, right? The labor movement and the civil rights movement. I'm going to try to show you where they mesh, but also where there's a lot of times divisions that happen and things to think about in the present when you're thinking about your own work, about how to avoid those kinds, how to keep the meshing going, how to keep the coalitions going without running into all of these roadblocks. And I'm also hoping to point out some of the pitfalls of the folks back then. You know, these folks in history aren't superheroes. They're rarely even heroes, right? I try not to talk about historical figures as heroes, but just as ordinary people doing sometimes extraordinary work. A lot of times when we talk about people in history as heroes, it sort of leaves all the rest of us out. Well, you can't be that person. Well, that person wasn't that person, right? That hero that you have, you know, this is a myth that we've built. And so maybe it's good to think about how ordinary people can get stuff done and how even our heroes are sometimes fairly ordinary people. I also wanted to thank Loretta for my mug. I don't usually drink out of a mug this big, but it has a great quote on it. It says, "Don't make me repeat myself. History." You get it? And so hopefully we can think about that too. You know, there are some pitfalls that people ran across that we, if we're smart, can avoid. History doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes, right? But we can still learn some stuff from it. So what I want to do, let's see here. I have some notes, and then I'm just going to go. But I did want to go over some. I got to move this. I can keep on hitting this one. I'll just is this going to work? There we go. I wanted to go over just some main points that I'm going to talk about. Number one, I think when you think about the civil rights movement and the labor movement together, the civil rights movement was not just about buses, schools, and voting. I think that was very clear from what Professor Kirk was saying. I think a major part of what the civil rights movement is about work. It's about your life at work. It's about discrimination at work. It's about access to jobs where people of color and women are often excluded, or really excluded. It's about conditions at work. It's about pay and those kinds of things. And when you look at the civil rights movement, the history of the civil rights movement, you see that a lot. Yes, you've got the Brown versus Board of Education about schooling and so on. The Civil Rights Act is passed, and you're talking about a lot of times about segregation when you talk about the Civil Rights Act. But work is always there. How are people treated at work? What kind of hours do they work? What kind of wages do they get? What kind of opportunities for advancement do they get? And so the civil rights movement is key to that story, and the labor movement in that way is key to the civil rights movement. And that would be another thing. Sometimes the civil rights movement had to be fought within the labor movement. And this gets to one of those pieces of our history that's pretty ugly. You know, personally, I'm a pro-labor person, right? But just in the same way that I'm, as I tell some of my students sometimes, just in the same way that I'm pro-Green Bay Packers, I admit when they lose, right? Or I admit when, if you want to tell the history of something, you don't do people any favors by glossing over some negative aspects of the history. Now that said, I'm going to gloss over some of it. We've got an hour, you know, and I'm going to try to focus on some of the more bright parts of this movement, but just know that there's a long history of racism as well within the labor movement. And that's been a huge fight of the civil rights movement, is to make the labor movement what it claims to be. But I would also like to say that sometimes the labor movement was a major player in the civil rights movement, which is something that is almost always behind the scenes or under the surface, which I think is a really interesting story to tell. And so what I'm going to do to get started here, what I want to do is talk about a story from the 1940s as a kind of teaser to get us into this. And then I want to back up a little bit and talk about, roll the clock back a bit to the early 1900s and really the 1930s as a key moment to try to understand how the labor movement becomes involved with the civil rights movement. This is the long civil rights movement. This is a term that people have started to use in the last 20 years. The idea that somehow the civil rights movement is only really between 1954 and 1968, you know, bookending it, right, with Brown versus Board of Education and King's assassination. We want to stretch it out and talk about how the civil rights movement is an ongoing thing. And Karla did a great job of showing that. It's those 1950s and 60s years are important, but you've got all of this, you've got all of this ice under the water. You've got just the tip of the iceberg that you see, but there's all of this giant mountain of ice underneath of it, underneath that surface iceberg, and that's probably going to be the thing that helps us sink the Titanic of white supremacy. I don't know. Anyway. And then I want to move up to that classical phase of the civil rights movement and talk about how these stories can mesh together, or how they did mesh together a little bit. All right, so okay, Paul, what about that story? And then we'll get into the implications for us today, I hope. Yeah, there it is. That story from the 1940s. Local 15 of the FTA, the Food, Tobacco, and Agricultural Workers. It had been another name. It was an early CIO union. We'll get into that in a bit here. But this is in Charleston, South Carolina in 1945. Here you have a new union, basically cigar makers, mainly black women, some black men, and then in the skilled trades in this company, you have white men, and the clerical workers were white women. They're all in the same union, but this is an African-American run union. It was a segregated, this is Charleston, South Carolina. So this building that you see here, obviously it's closed up now. I know it's probably lofts, right? That's what they always do in these places. Turn it into lofts or dynamite it. But each floor was segregated in this place. But there are about 2,000 workers in this particular American Tobacco Company firm, factory. And the important thing about this, I think, is that we're in Charleston, South Carolina. This is the crucible of the Confederacy. This is the center of the resistance to any effort at the civil rights, in the civil rights movement in the 1930s and 40s. This is the place where Strom Thurmond is governor of South Carolina. Strom Thurmond, who was my senator when I was in college. Strom Thurmond, who lasts forever, proving that the good die young. He was the arch segregationist. He's the arch segregationist here. And so you have 2,000, mainly women, African-American workers, going out on strike in that milieu. I mean, just that itself is guts. That's incredible. But one of the things that I think is kind of important to point out about this strike, as a way to get us to begin to talking about other things, but also to weave in what Karla was mentioning, is that there were other FTA locals throughout the country, other FTA locals outside of the South, in which black workers worked too, and they went on strike as well. This is back when sympathy strikes were still somewhat legal, but they also engaged in a boycott. And in a way, that story of the Great Migration comes in right away in this first story I'm going to tell you. That is, black workers had moved to the north, and now they're using their power in other locals and their unions in the north, where they have a little more political elbow room. They're using their power and their dues money to support people in the South as they go on strike. Now, these folks who are going on strike here, you really can't just call the FTA a union, or I shouldn't say it that way. You can't just call it only a labor action. This is a labor and civil rights action. You cannot separate those two things. It's labor and civil rights together. And building power in this factory and through their union, they're going to be able to begin to build power in that city of Charleston against that incredibly oppressive system. You know, I think about it, this union came in 1944, right at the end of the war. They had been fighting to build this union through the war, and they finally got forced the American Tobacco Company to accept it. The American Tobacco Company said, well, okay, we're not going to give you any raises because it's wartime, and we're trying to keep wages down, but we'll give you back pay when the war is over. And that's what this strike is going to be about. It's going to be about getting higher pay and then also the back pay. But think about this, folks. All of these people in these pictures here, all of these folks, they voted for a union. And a lot of times when you think about the South and organizing in the South in the 1930s and 40s, this is the first time black people in their entire lives have ever voted. They can't vote for their mayor. They can't vote for their city council or school board. They can't vote for president. There's been the literacy test, the poll tax, a campaign of terror to keep black people from voting, especially in the rural territories. But in the union movement, especially among those unions that were more militant in organizing black workers, now you've got this experiment in democracy that's going on, that's training people for democracy outside of the movement. So Local 15 is a pretty big deal. There's another thing that I think really connects us with the civil rights movement and this particular strike. They win, by the way. They won the strike, which is a rare thing sometimes. But notice it's basically 6 months long, so it was a long strike. But they ended up getting their back pay, they ended up getting a raise, and they ended up keeping their union. Now this union is going to be destroyed in the Cold War, because this is one of those left-wing unions from the CIO that was associated with the Communist Party back in the day, and so the Cold War is going to crush, well, I shouldn't say crush this union, they're going to have to shift their tactics, let's put it that way. But the FTA is going to disappear, they're going to join with other folks. But this is one of the key things that I wanted to bring up about, this is why I'm bringing up this particular strike and this particular local. And that is, in that strike, this is the first time that anthem of the civil rights movement was ever sung in a movement kind of situation. It came from the black church, this song, "We Shall Overcome," "I'll Overcome Someday," and this woman, Lucille Simmons, is the one who was singing it on the picket line, and people picked it up and began to sing, "We Shall Overcome." I won't play the whole thing, but let me just give you a little taste here. Let's see.
In the process of working throughout the South and going to jail and getting beat and being in mass meetings and singing was one particular song that became the theme song struggle. And you will find this song, and in the
Sorry.
process of working throughout
Sorry, whoops, I
and
clicked
going to
on it.
jail and getting beat and being in mass meetings and singing was one particular song that became the theme song of this movement. It's a powerful song. You can go anywhere in the world today where there is struggle, and you will find this song, and you will still see people in the streets marching and singing it. It is our gift to the world people in struggle. We want to ask you to stand up and cross your right hand over left and sing with us, We Shall Overcome. We shall overcome.
You know this song, right? Yeah, everybody. So, I think a lot of times people kind of, cynical types kind of roll their eyes, maybe when they hear this song, oh, this is the old song of the movement, and everybody's kumbaya, all this kind of stuff. But imagine the situation, right? You're on that line in Charleston, South Carolina. It's a potentially explosive, violent situation. And singing this song, and then later on, 15, 20 years later, when it becomes an anthem of the movement, singing this song kind of brings you together, right? Well, I'll let them finish this verse.
In the process...
Sorry. I'm always interested in songs because well, have you ever, Sweet Honey in the Rock, what's the name of Bernice? I want to forget.
Reagan.
Yeah, Bernice Johnson Reagan. She talks in an interview about the importance of song, right? You're in a place, you're having this meeting, it's within this incredibly oppressive racial order, this whole system that exists. The cops are all outside taking down all the license plate numbers of everybody who's come to the meeting so that they can intimidate you and threaten you. Then they come into the church or wherever you're having your meeting. It's an open meeting, so they come in to intimidate you, and they take the space. And the way Bernice Johnson Reagan talks about this is, then you start singing, and now the air is yours again, and you take it back, and you create this group where maybe it was just individuals. And she talks about the difference between I songs and we songs. It's beautiful. Email me, I'll send you the interview. It's great. But that idea, I think, is really, really key. This idea of solidarity being transferred to very many different movements. But this, the reason why I have Lily Mae Doster there is because I interviewed her when she was 80-something years old in the 1990s. She was totally blind. Still in Charleston, and I was interviewing her about this strike, but also about her participation throughout, and the other folks from Local 15, their participation throughout the movement. Not just in Charleston, which was a pretty quiet place during the high point of the civil rights movement, but also in other parts of the country where they went and engaged in protests for civil rights and so on. But their kind of school was this place. I'll explain how that song became the song later. A couple of years after that strike, though, they did more than just win at the workplace. They also formed their own political party within the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party in the South was the only party in town. I mean, that's the only game in town. And it was a white supremacist party. And so the idea was, well, we're going to form the Progressive Democratic Party, the PDP. And they, again, facing down all of that incredible amount of potential terror, at least, if not terror, they registered some 1,500 African Americans to vote in Charleston, South Carolina, of all places. And let me tell you, this scared the hell out of the powers that be in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. They knew where their power came from. It came from control over that ballot box and the vote. And again, a lot of us cynics look at it and we kind of agree with that bumper sticker. You know, I don't know if you've seen the bumper sticker. It says, if voting changed anything, it would be illegal. Right? If voting, oh, okay, well, yeah, there we go. Well, if voting changed anything, it would be illegal. Well, here's the thing. It was illegal. Right. I mean, it's not the only thing. It's perhaps the least you can do. But it is, I mean, clearly the people who ran that society recognized what was at stake if they let half their population, the African American population, vote. They knew they would lose power. And that's why they tried to stop it from happening. That's why they tried to stop it from happening in the workplace, and why they tried to stop it from happening statewide and nationally. That's why they killed people, because they didn't want people to build that power. So anyway, I just thought I would throw that out there as a first item, this idea that the labor movement here is connected to the civil rights movement. There's some political kinds of shifts that happen that mean that it seems to sort of separate itself and then come back together again. But I want to back up the clock a little bit and talk about, at least mention, more than mention, that the history of organized labor in America and workers in general is not just a history about the working class in a way that sometimes people talk about it. We're the working class, and so all these other divisions between us, divisions along lines of sex or race, all of that, or ethnicity or immigration status, all of these things are superfluous to the fact that we're all working class. Well, race and ethnicity and gender all become very, very important in the movement, and sometimes it's pretty ugly. I guess what I'm trying to say in a very shorthand way is a lot of the history of the labor movement in the early 20th century especially is one of trying to protect white men's jobs through organizations, trying to exclude people of color and women. And now part of that is just reflecting already the division of labor that had been built. That is, even before unions, skilled workers in many ways, skilled white men in many ways, work to protect their privileges and keep those jobs just to themselves. Those are the kind of, and then they use their organizations to double down on that kind of protection. So in other words, if you're in a craft union, for instance, in the late 19th century, if you're in the machinists, or the typographical union, or the meat cutters, the butchers, you're almost all going to be all white anyway, right? And then you join the union and then use that power of that union to protect those privileges. That's a huge problem that we have in the history of the labor movement that's unfortunate. And it's not only African American workers and women, but out here on the West Coast, one of the big things in the late 19th century was the anti-Asian hysteria. The enormous amounts, really, a hysteria over Chinese and then later Japanese workers. This is a picture of the Workingmen's Party march in 1877 in San Francisco. But the Workingmen's Party here, which wrote our Constitution in California, the one that we're still under, had, well, it's kind of, I would say it's infamous. The Workingmen's Party did more to make our Constitution than any other political party, and one of the things that they really insisted on putting in there is that we would be able to, as a state and as communities, be able to force Chinese people into segregated vice districts. It's right there in the Constitution. Thankfully, it's been amended out of the Constitution, but that's there, and that's something to remember, that history of racism. Even as late as the eve of World War II, some 25 AFL craft unions still excluded black workers, some even in their constitutions. Other unions had a much better history of this. The mine workers, the longshore workers, the needle trades, they had a much better history of it. But even in those unions, in spite of their rhetoric of racial equality, there was a practical day-to-day racism that would go on. So in other words, what I'm trying to say here is that basic point, that the labor movement needed to have a civil rights movement within it before it could be a real player in helping the civil rights movement outside of it. But some unions were ahead of others, I would say. And we see this really, I think, in the era of mass organizing in the 1930s. The labor movement, as far as the number of workers and unions go, there's this big, huge push in the late 19th century, and then counteraction that, they're crushed, and then in the early 20th century, you see the craft unions grow up, and then during World War I, a lot of the AFL craft unions make an alliance with the government, and they basically say, all right, we're going to get defense contractors to recognize our unions. But then after that, they were crushed again in 1919. So the 1930s is the time where you see the real, I'd call it permanent, except it wasn't, the real multi-generational permanency, I guess, of workers and unions. And there are lots of opportunities for interracial unionizing and organizing the so-called unorganized. That was kind of the slogan of the 1930s. We need to organize the unorganized. The notion here was that the AFL, while organizing highly skilled workers, most AFL unions would organize along lines of skill and say, well, all right, if you're a machinist, you could be in the union, but if you're just a line worker, let's say, at Ford or GM, you're an unskilled worker, and there's not a huge effort to organize them, really, by AFL-type unions until the 1930s. And then in the 1930s, this wave of what people called industrial unionism kind of swept through. Now, this had happened a couple other times in the late 1890s, in the early 19 teens, but industrial unionism had been fairly well defeated in the railroads, in basic industry, and if you remember your history survey class, your U.S. history survey class, you've got the Homestead strike, just basically expelling labor from the steel industry. You've got the Pullman strike and the Pullman boycott, expelling industrial unionism from the railroads, and so industrial unionism kind of became a rallying cry of a lot of the more militant workers. We're going to organize these hundreds and hundreds, millions of so-called unskilled workers. Usually, by the way, unskilled also is, if you look at the job, it's sometimes pretty damn skilled. It just happens to be work done by women or people of color, and so they changed back in the day. And sometimes this wasn't even done through, let's say, the typical AFL-type unions. In 1933, there was the big cotton strike. Sometimes it was organizing the unorganized, even in agriculture, which was seen by a lot of labor as kind of not worth our attention, not worth our time, because these folks are migrant laborers, they get paid very little, they can be easily replaced, they're very often immigrants, but even if they're not immigrants, they're migrants, and so they don't have the basic power of residency even. And so this strike here, I think, kind of sets the mood in the 1930s. The cotton strike right here in the Central Valley, up and down the Central Valley. It's the biggest agricultural strike in American history. tens of thousands of mainly Mexican and Mexican-American workers, but a lot of Filipinos also joining up and going on strike. A few Anglos are joining up, but not a huge amount. This is one of these things that I think is kind of vetoed from our history. This attempt by these, I mean, we know Cesar Chavez, but we kind of forgot that this has been swept under the rug in our history. When I do my big, huge classes of 200 students, I ask my students in the class, how many of you have heard of the 1933 cotton strike? And maybe 2 out of 200 will have heard of it, even though it happened right here. 4 people were killed. The Mexican consulate, the guy from the Mexican consulate tried to intervene at one point in a kind of dueling, vigilantes versus strikers. Mexican consulate tries to intervene. He gets knocked to the ground and murdered in cold blood in the middle of the street. And both the guilty and innocent are arrested, and both the guilty and innocent go free. It's quite the moment there. The cotton strike. Now, this isn't a victory for these agricultural workers. I mean, they get a little bit, but they get a little bit of money, which is something, right? They were going for $1 for every 100 pounds of cotton that they pick, and they were getting paid 60 cents, which is bad, folks. Just so you know, this means your family could make $5 a day. Your whole family working could maybe make $5 a day if you're lucky. If you're lucky, and picking cotton is no fun. They get 75 cents. But they get no permanent organization in the fields, and that's key. The fight is going to have, the struggle is going to have to go on. This is a really militant union. It was led by communists, and of course that whole world of the Red Scare helped to crush their attempts to make a permanent union there. There we are, Corcoran. There's their big camp. That they had. One smaller grower was sympathetic with the union, settled with the union, and basically said, okay, you can be on my land and set up your camps. And then immediately the health authorities come in and say, oh, this is all filthy. You're running your latrines wrong. We need to shut this thing down. As if they had ever done that before in migrant camps, right? It's a strikers camp. We're going to use the health authorities to shut it down. There's Pat Chambers addressing the crowd there. This is October 33. Lots of locals here were basically deputized. Get axe handles in the hands of as many people as possible and fight it out. There's Pixley. That's where a couple of people were killed. That's probably the most famous picture of the entire strike. Disarm the rich farmer, arm the worker for self-defense. Pretty militant stance of that union. Now it goes on all through the 1930s, these attempts to organize agricultural workers, but they mainly fail, these attempts. This is one of the organizers, Caroline Decker, who came here fresh from Elizabethtown, Tennessee, and the Gastonia, North Carolina textile workers strikes, and I mean, she's being sent all around the country to raise hell, I guess. And there she is, because here in California, it was illegal to do all of this kind of stuff, or at least so said the courts. We had a law in the books called the Criminal Syndicalism Act, and it basically made it illegal to be part of any organization which wanted to change the industrial order of the society. Well, she's a communist, so there we go. This is the red file in Sacramento's. There's Pat Chambers. They spent most of half of the 1930s in San Quentin. But throughout the 1930s, we see more agricultural organizing, not by CAWIU, which was their original union, but later on another one called UCAPO. We don't need to get into it very much. In a way, this valley was turned into kind of an armed camp for a portion of the 1930s. Whoops, that's the same picture. There we go. Some of these pictures, they just get me. I love this one of the reporters. They know what to expect. all with their gas masks. There's a couple of really good books on this, besides Dan's. There's Dark Sweat, White Gold. I love this book because this author talks about how a lot of these workers who are going on strike had experience of doing this kind of work south of the border. A lot of them were veterans of the Mexican Revolution just 20 years earlier. And so they had these kinds of experiences. This book, American Fascism and the New Deal, the Associated Farmers of California. One of the things I like to remind my students of in civil rights class is that civil rights organizations, social movements, a lot of times they're really organized, they've got lots of resources, but they almost never have as many resources as the people they're up against. And we kind of forget about that. Right? We talk about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, we talk about the Congress of Racial Equality, we talk about Martin Luther King's group, the SCLC or the NAACP, and all of these organizations. But they're up against the White Citizens Council, not just the KKK, right? The White Citizens Council, which is the middle-class KKK. They're up against all the organized power of that society. And the Associated Farmers were one of those groups. We're talking an alliance between the insurance companies, the banks, the big co-ops, and the growers. This was big. In the South, we've got something else. I just like doing this one. Yeah, because what does STFU mean? Everybody knows what STFU means. It means the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, right? The Southern Tenant Farmers Union. Down south, those sharecroppers who hadn't moved yet out of the South tried to improve their own situation in, again, that system of terror. This is another example of the civil rights movement within the labor movement. Here are these folks. The New Deal is in. Franklin Roosevelt has come in. He's gotten passed a law, the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And this law is supposed to deliver relief to farmers. But the thing about that law is basically it's going to deliver relief to farm owners. And so the big owners of land in the South are able to pocket those checks, those subsidy checks from the AAA, and not hand them down to the actual farmers, the people who are actually growing the cotton and picking the cotton, the sharecroppers. As a matter of fact, what happens in the 1930s sometimes is, well, you might remember this. The idea was you're supposed to take land out of production. You've grown 1,000 acres of cotton this year. We're going to grow 900 acres this year, and we're going to leave the rest fallow to raise the price of the cotton crop. And it works. That works. And you give people an incentive to not grow the crop by just paying them for the crop. You give them the check. Well, that check was supposed to go to these southern tenant farmers, right? The tenant farmers and the sharecroppers. And it wasn't going to them. And on top of that, the rent, the so-called rent that you would pay would be a portion of your crop. As the price of the crop goes down, more of a portion of your total crop will maybe be demanded by the landlord. The landlord has all the power here. They can kick you off the land. And we see this in the 1950s and even in the early 60s when there's very few sharecroppers left in the South. But you see this happen where the white community facing an organized tenant revolt of a kind, a revolt, yeah, they wanted to vote. They all get kicked off the land, and then the white community boycotted the black community, wouldn't let them come into their grocery stores to get food. This had to go all the way to John F. Kennedy to order the USDA to send actual relief food to them in 1960. This is 1935, 36, 37. This group isn't run by the communists, this is run by the Socialist Party, the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. And they were taking from efforts that had happened many times before of black farmers to try to get a better deal. The most significant moment here was 1919 in Elaine, Arkansas, when several black farmers, cotton farmers, sharecroppers decided to form a sharecroppers union. That meeting was attacked by the police. There was a bit of a fight, and then a massacre occurred, in which we don't know how many black farmers were killed. Somewhere between 25 and 100 is what people say. We kind of bury these things. These guys, you see these pictures here because these guys were all arrested for insurrection for joining a union. You're engaged in revolution for joining a union, and they were initially sentenced to death for it. Thankfully, some people came to their aid, some lawyers came to their aid and got that undone. But you get an idea of what folks were up against. And so here you are, 13, 14 years later, and yeah, there we go. Negroes beware, do not attend communist meetings. The Communist Party was also involved in there's a great book on it. This guy, Robin Kelly, Hammer and Hoe, great name, isn't it? Instead of Hammer and Sickle. But the Southern Tenant Farmers Union wasn't a communist group. They were part of the Socialist Party trying to organize, but they too were shut down, the STFU. One of the things about the Southern Tenant Farmers Union that I think needs to be pointed out, though, is that this was an occasion of black and white unite to fight. In other words, they're engaged not just as a union, but they're also beginning to try to tear down those racial walls that had been so thoroughly built up in the South. And so you can imagine the powers that be in the South, in Arkansas, where this was pretty popular, in Texas, where this was popular, this was the big no-no. Right? Not only are you joining a union, but you're also crossing the color line. They're playing checkers together, right? I mean, this is what's going on. And this was a huge offense to the people who ruled the South. And the people who ruled the South in the 1930s had another ally, and that was the Democratic Party of the United States. What we see in the 1930s, which is really difficult to kind of talk about in just a few minutes. But what we see in the 1930s is the development of the split personality of the Democratic Party. As all of those black workers move out of the South and into the North and West, they have a little bit of political elbow room. Right? They can vote. They can exert a kind of electoral political power that black workers in the South can't. And the Democratic Party in the 1930s gets those voters. African Americans moved out of the Republican camp and into the Democratic Party camp in the North in the 1930s. Roosevelt was incredibly popular. His New Deal in the North benefited a lot of black workers, things like Social Security and minimum wage and maximum hours and the right to join a union. That worked up in the North, and black workers benefited from that, and they rewarded Roosevelt. So in other words, the Democratic Party in the North is beginning to say, we're for civil rights. And the Democratic Party in the South is saying loud and clear, we're for white supremacy. So same political party. And these folks fall victim to that. You can see it. Right? The question is, will Roosevelt say one good word about the STFU? He's so enormously popular, that would create so much room politically for these folks to organize. But he says not one word. As a matter of fact, he doubles down on his support for Jim Robinson, the senator from Arkansas at the time. He doubles down on support for the senator, the white supremacist Dixiecrat senator, basically saying, you're the guys I'm going to support. Why? Well, because in Congress, they ran all the big committees, and they could stop just about anything Roosevelt wanted. So that's what these folks are up against. Remember, they can't vote. Almost none of these folks can vote, white and black. Desperately poor white voters very often were excluded as well. Almost all black voters, almost all black citizens were excluded from the vote. And lots and lots of white workers were too. I just like that picture. I think it's kind of nice. So the STFU and the story of the 1933 cotton strike give you an idea of what that movement is up against in the 1930s. For me at least, that balance of political forces, people realize we're going to have to upset that balance of political forces in the South. The South is the place to crack it. But there's also an enormous amount of work that can be done by black workers in the North, in acts of solidarity with workers in the South, to recreate the Southern political economic system. That's kind of the story, for me at least. Oh yeah, there's Roosevelt. The beginnings of the New Deal protections, things like Social Security, unemployment insurance, 8-hour day, time and a half for overtime, the right to join a union, the Social Security Act, Social Security. All of these things come in during Roosevelt's time. The right to join a union comes in under the Wagner Act, and then there's the Fair Labor Standards Act. Almost all of these acts, almost all parts of these acts, exclude agricultural workers and domestic workers. They exclude them, which is really, really important, I think. It shows the balance of political power here. All of these acts that are going to mean, for industrial workers in the North, are going to mean middle-class lives, are not going to be extended to agricultural and domestic workers in the South and the West. Now, that's a lot of white workers, too, in the South and the West who are agricultural workers. But it's overwhelmingly, disproportionately people of color. African Americans in the South, some African Americans here in the Central Valley, and of course Mexican Americans and other Filipino Americans here and Japanese Americans here. They're basically excluded from this whole system. So you get an idea of what that civil rights movement is going to be up against in the economic realm. There were some glimmers here of, I would say, hope. In the 1930s, in the middle of the 1930s, a lot of the folks who said we should be organizing industrially, not by craft, but by industry. If you're working in an auto plant, it doesn't matter if you're a machinist or a guy who sweeps the floor, you're an auto worker, you should join the United Auto Workers, right? I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but the idea of industrial unionism takes hold again. But think about this. If the skilled jobs are held mainly by white men, but the unskilled jobs are millions and millions of, yes, more white men, but also people who are newly immigrants to the country, people who are people of color, women, and so on. Now you've got this chance to do real interracial organizing. The CIO was a great experiment, could have been a greater experiment in interracial organizing. We can organize hundreds of thousands of black workers, and in some cases, they did. I would say that some of the best examples are the United Packing House Workers of America. I would say the UAW, except it depends during the time and not. But in Detroit, huge numbers of black workers had moved up there in the Great Migration. In Chicago, huge numbers had moved up there to work in these packing houses, killing cows and pigs and making them for us. These folks are all up there doing that kind of work. They organize into CIO unions, Congress of Industrial Organization Unions, and these are the black workers whose dues go into not just their own organization, but also sometimes go into those civil rights organizations that rise up in the 1950s and 60s. One of the things in my class, I've taught this class for 18 years, and one of the things that really, really constantly comes back to me is, how do they pay for it all? Right? There's lawyers. Lawyers charge money. They don't do it all for free. Right? You need to move from place to place. You need to feed people. You need to have bail money. Where do you get the bail money? Where do you get the money to buy an airplane ride for Martin Luther King? He's not paying for it out of his pocket. Right? And a lot of times what it comes down to is these unions. You can see why the Southern power structure as it existed in the 1930s, 40s, 50s really pushed back against organizing unions in the South, because they knew how that would crack that white supremacist system. They knew that would be part of the destruction of the system that they had built. And you can see why they're that group within the Democratic Party in the 1940s who really pushes for a restriction on union rights. Because they know what's at stake. They're not doing it because they think it's fun to do. They know where their power comes from, and they know where their power is being challenged, and they want to destroy those institutions that are going to challenge their power. And they're pretty good at it, these folks, these white Southerners in those movements. The CIO had several unions that were on the far left that really made a big point of organizing the unorganized black workers of the South. A lot of these are unions that barely exist anymore, don't even exist anymore. Farm equipment workers, they got merged into the UAW, the FE it was called. Another group, the mine, mill, and smelter workers, a hugely important industrial union in the South, organizing lots of black workers. The story I started with, the food, tobacco, and agricultural workers, those folks are organizing in the South. And you get the National Negro Congress. Yeah, there's the mine, mill, and smelter workers. Or they just called it mine mill. Lily Mae Doster, the woman I interviewed about that song and all of that stuff in that strike, Lily Mae Doster's husband was a mine mill guy who worked just up the road from Charleston in a plant there. But that CIO, those CIO unions were a real chance to break a kind of feudal system that existed in places like Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham was the industrial center of Birmingham and Chattanooga and those. They're industrial places. We don't think of the South as industrial, but steel and coal is Birmingham. They name it Birmingham for a reason, right? Naming it after the industrial center of England. But the world, yeah, look at the Vulcan in him. There he is. He's on a big statue. The question was, are we going to be able to break the power of Birmingham's, political, might? You've got these big mules, they call them, the guys who basically ran industry, but also ran the Democratic Party. Will the CIO be able to come into those firms, whether it's the mines or the mills, the steel mills? Will the CIO be able to come in, organize black and white workers enough to be able to challenge the power of that white supremacist Democratic Party? That's what some people in the CIO were trying to do in the 1930s. They failed. They failed. They weren't able to build that interracial coalition. But there is a moment there. You can see exactly what they're doing. They need to crack this nut. This white, this Democratic Party in the South that was white supremacist. Proudly so, they'd say, right? How do we break that? You build an interracial coalition with a base, and that base is that union. Now, they weren't able to succeed. The CIO tried to finance another group called the Southern Conference on Human Welfare to try to deal with all these problems of moving from civil rights to human rights, as Karla said, and I brought the book, from civil rights to human rights. The Southern Conference on Human Welfare tried to do this, and they had heavy hitters from the Northern Democratic Party, the liberal wing of it, the pro-civil rights wing, and of course, who's this? Eleanor Roosevelt, yeah. So she comes in and tries to lend her gravitas to the movement. And then they had a big conference meeting in Birmingham. Birmingham is segregated. My God, I'm just babbling, aren't I? No, okay. Sorry, I just looked at the time. Birmingham is segregated. So this young guy, who happened to be basically the Commissioner of Public Safety in Birmingham, who you've probably heard of, Bull Connor, comes in 1939 here, and says, all right, you guys, you're all integrated and everything. All you N-words, you go over here. All you white folks, you're over here. We're going to segregate. And he takes a fire hose, and brings it down the middle of the whole room, right? Brings it down the room and just sits it there. And then Eleanor Roosevelt picks up her chair and puts it right over the hose, and puts one foot on one side and one foot on the other, right? That's her big protest. Right? Well, I tell that story, but, and it's nice to end it there, isn't it? You know, it's cool, nice protest. Eleanor Roosevelt lost. Bill Connor won in that one. That place wasn't going to be integrated, and he won. She lost. The First Lady of the United States gets the middle finger from this guy. That's how strong that system is, right? We're gonna, and the Southern Conference for Human Welfare stuck around for a few years, but never really had that chance to, again, crack that nut. So there's all these attempts that are just beautiful in history, but so sad, to build that labor civil rights kind of coalition, to build that interracial coalition. There's another side to the story, and that is those organizations that were very often vast majority African American or all black unions. And you see there a real sense of the idea that their job as a union wasn't just to get the dime, you know, a couple extra dimes for their members. Their job as a union was to use their power to help free their brothers and sisters outside of that union, to help change that society. And you see this with A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. The railroad brotherhoods had pretty much excluded all black people from working on the railroad, except in those jobs as waiter or laborer or a sleeping car porter, in which almost every sleeping car porter was black. And these folks are, you know, getting on the train up north, and they're taking the Chicago Defender, the black newspaper, and taking it south and selling it south, trying to spread the movement that way, these folks. A. Philip Randolph's going to spend his entire career trying to build that larger interracial movement here. Again, you see this with real connections with Eleanor Roosevelt and even Franklin Roosevelt as we're coming on to World War II. And in World War II, what A. Philip Randolph did is he said to Franklin Roosevelt, look, if you don't do something about the fact that we have black workers being excluded from industry, if you don't do something about this discrimination that's going on in industry, we're going to have a march on Washington. And your great and wonderful war against Nazism and fascist racists will be revealed for the hypocrisy that it is. And so Roosevelt basically says, no, don't march on Washington. I'll give you an executive order. At 8802, the Fair Employment Practices Commission, the first federal level kind of organization that said you cannot discriminate in employment against people on the basis of their color and national origin. It's a commission that's set up to study complaints. Hey, black folks have been excluded totally from airplane manufacture. Well, these are great jobs. These are the jobs out here on the West Coast that people are engaging in the Great Migration to come take these jobs, and yet they're totally excluded. At the beginning of the war, there weren't even 100 black people in aviation in the entire country. They are totally frozen out. By the end of the war, through FEPC, we have 107,000 non-whites in aircraft. This is civil rights activism in the case of a threatened march on Washington as a way to get that concession from the powers that be, in spite of the fact that, frankly, Roosevelt was just not really wanting to do this. You had to threaten the guy, right? He didn't want to offend all these Southern folks in his party. So you had to make it costly. And that's what A. Philip Randolph does. Of course, he never gets his March on Washington, and that's why he's up there in 1963 as one of the great organizers of the March on Washington with King and I Have a Dream and all of that stuff. That's A. Philip Randolph's march. He finally got his march 22 years later. But all these black workers moving into shipbuilding and ordnance, and I mean, we're talking moving from maybe, you know, $6 a week picking cotton, if you're lucky, in the South, to real money during World War II in these industries in the West, up in Chicago and Detroit and elsewhere. And these are some propaganda photos from the 1940s, right? But that's not to say that there wasn't still, again, this incredible racial tension that's exacerbated in the war. The UAW had been formed in Detroit in the 1930s, and a lot of what that union leadership did was really trying to discipline its own membership, frankly. The membership would go on wildcat strikes against black workers moving into a particular shop that had been all white until that time. And it literally exploded into a riot in Detroit. This fight over jobs, over who gets access to so-called white jobs. And so you see 23 people killed, and the army has to come in and occupy Detroit in the middle of World War II. That's what we're talking about here. I like this one too. In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the bus drivers went out on strike because the FEPC said they had to hire a black bus driver. What a crazy idea, hiring a black bus driver. So they all went out on strike, tipped over the buses, did all kinds, they had to be occupied as well. The buses did, by troops. I love these signs though. We drive tanks, why not trolleys? Right? It's quite something. If Negro men can carry guns for Uncle Sam, surely they can drive milk wagons for Bowen and Derry. That's Chicago. You think about it, at Derry, somebody delivering milk is crossing those color lines every day, going into the white neighborhood from the black neighborhood. The big no-no of the time. This is huge. Well, let me spend the last 5 minutes here, or a little bit more, talking about the stuff that you know about. I shouldn't say that. You know all this stuff, but talking about the stuff that we're all familiar with, the civil rights movement. And I'm just going to try to give you impressions, just a suggestion of how the labor movement is involved with that civil rights movement. There's a kind of civil rights unionism that I already started this thing with. The story of the FTA and the tobacco workers. The big FTA local was actually FTA Local 22 in Winston-Salem. And there's a great book on that called Civil Rights Unionism by Robert Korstad, who is the son of the organizers. So, you get an idea of it there. But in the late 1940s, there was an attempt to organize again in the South, which again collapsed under the weight of racism and the Red Scare, Operation Dixie. So that Cold War Red Scare had a real effect on that labor civil rights coalition. But what about that movement of the 50s and 60s? What's the connection there? Well, I'm going to leave Brown, except to say that that's a cool person, Barbara Jones, and the strike she led to start the Brown versus Board of Education. One of the 5 cases that were Brown versus Board of Education. I'll skip that. Some of the activists in the 1950s began to use some of those same tactics that were pioneered in the labor movement. Whoops. No wonder I had 160 slides. I just noticed they've gotten repeated. Here we go. The Montgomery bus boycott, I think at the very beginning today, somebody mentioned that, right? That the Montgomery bus boycott was not just a boycott of buses, but it was a kind of almost a strike. That is, women who would work in white people's homes are basically saying, we're not going to work until we can make our way to your home in some sort of dignity. So that Montgomery bus boycott is important in that way. There you go. You've probably seen this picture. This one was staged later on, for the papers and all that stuff. That's Rosa Parks getting her fingerprinted and everything. She's the one who sat down, remember? And the way I think, hopefully these days we don't tell it this way anymore. It all started on December 1st, 1955, when Rosa Parks was tired after her day as a seamstress, and she sat down and she refused to get up. Now a lot of times the white backlash to this, what a lot of the folks who talked about these civil rights activists, they would say, oh, those folks, Rosa Parks isn't just some lady. She's an agitator. She's been trained. She's, and they would say it like if this is a bad thing. And the fact is, It's true, she was, right? I mean, she would not have ever been heard of if she hadn't been. She was part of this larger organization. She was involved with the mine mill and smelter workers back in the 1930s. She was involved with defense of the Scottsboro Boys in the 1930s, the big attempt to railroad 9 young men to their deaths for a false accusation of rape. She was involved in all sorts of activities all through the 1940s and 50s. One of the things I think that is kind of important to mention here is the kind, I hate to use the word training, but the kind of training that people like Rosa Parks and every other major figure in the civil rights movement received. You don't just go out on a protest, right? You don't just sit down and say, all right, that's that. You've got to organize this kind of stuff. And one of the places where this was done was the Highlander Folk School up in the hills in Tennessee. Miles Horton had established this in the 1920s. It became a big CIO training spot. All these organizers in the CIO were trained there. And then the CIO kind of abandoned it because he was considered too far left and he didn't toe the line on the Cold War stuff. And so he shifted into civil rights organizing. Miles Horton in the old CIO training school. There it is, little place. People would go up there. This is where those workers from Charleston went up to the mountains and they taught We Shall Overcome to Miles Horton's wife, Zelphia, who redid the song and then basically sent it back out amongst all the other activists who were training up at the Highlander Folk School. There's Septima Clark, the great teacher of reading so that people could pass literacy tests. There's Rosa Parks right there at the Highlander Folk School. Yeah, that's the Highlander Folk School 3 years ago. That was outside Knoxville, Tennessee now. But it's been destroyed many times. He's like, why do you destroy my place? You can't destroy an idea. You know, what are you doing? You know? But you get the sense of it. So a lot of folks mobilized behind Rosa Parks in that movement. She did the sit down, but there were all kinds of other folks. Joanne Robinson of the Women's Political Council, who liberated 20,000 leaflets from her university. I'm not going to say we're going to steal your resources, but that's what she did. She got in trouble for it. To do the flyers for the boycott. Johnny Carr, longtime NAACP activist. Of course, Claudette Colvin, NAACP youth activist, whose case it was that actually did go all the way to the courts and is the victorious decision in the bus boycott. But one thing I wanted to talk about is this guy here, E.D. Nixon. One of the reasons why people like Rosa Parks and other folks had the freedom to be able to do this is they couldn't be fired by their white boss because she didn't have one. She was part of the NAACP. She was part of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. This guy had been the head of the NAACP, was the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in Montgomery, Alabama. In other words, the pockets of a union are going to be paying for at least a piece of this fight. A. Philip Randolph's old union. That to me is an important story to tell about that bus boycott. There were very few white allies, but it was helpful to have at least Virginia and Clifford Durr, close friends of the Roosevelts, big-time allies of the New Deal side of the Democratic Party on their side. Virginia Durr has a long, long history of supporting civil rights, and Clifford Durr was a lawyer in the New Deal. It pays to have some of these kind of connected allies. E.D. Nixon, Joanne Robinson, Ralph Abernathy, Martin Luther King Jr. This is where he gets his start. Let me scroll through some of these things here. one of the people who kind of come into the fore here during the bus boycott is this guy, Bayard Rustin. Again, a man who had been active in the 1930s and 40s, engaged in labor, CIO work, but now moving full-fledged into the civil rights movement, trying to build that coalition. The proof that one truly believes is in action, and boy, he kind of showed it his whole life. Doing sit-downs before sit-downs, right? He was a gay man in a straight world. He was a communist in a capitalist world. He was a pacifist in a militarist world. That's why the name of that documentary is Brother Outsider. He left the Communist Party way back in the 30s, but still, there he is with King. I'm just going to scroll through some pictures here because I've got lots and lots of them. There he is. This is what the White Citizens Council put up all over the South, this billboard. King at Communist Training School, right? This is at Highland, right? That guy right next to him is a communist, by the way. There's Rosa Parks. Some of the best sites in America, some of the best portraits in America are in the Montgomery Police Department mugshot morgue, and in the Jackson, Mississippi mugshot morgue, and in any number of other places. You get a sense of it. Just a nice little quote. Strong people don't need strong leaders. I just love that. That's Ella Baker. She's executive director of King's group, but she doesn't quite agree with King's style of leadership, right? With that group's style of leadership. So, when you read about or see the stories of the Montgomery bus boycott, when you read about or see the stories of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, yes, you see those students sitting down who paid their bail. The Packing House Workers of America helped to pay their bail. The UAW paid their bail. These folks, black workers in the North, using their power within these industrial unions in the North, having to fight to get that power within their unions. They had to fight the movement in their unions, and then they used the power that they gained to extend the movement into the South. The sit-ins and SNCC, especially the Nashville folks, this is Packing House Workers of America money that came to them, and James Lawson and Diane Nash and all those figures, and John Lewis, all those figures that we're familiar with. When it came to the Birmingham struggle, where King and Abernathy and Fred Shuttlesworth shut down Birmingham with 100,000 protesters over the course of a month and a half. They have 15,000 arrests. And then finally, in the end, they bring out the children. The children all leave school and go through this very controversial move. And finally, when they bring out the children in these marches, that's when the cops sick the dogs on them and take out the fire hoses and start. You've seen these pictures of folks being taken out by Bull Connor, right? He's calling for the arrest of these children, starting on May 3rd, 1963. I love that picture. I love her. I mean, that's defiant. And there's that one that Karla showed you, this one right here. Fire hoses. You know, these protests went on and on and on, and the Birmingham authorities were just intransigent. We won't negotiate with you. And finally, the federal government came in because it was just such a powder keg. The federal government comes in and sends in mediators. But one of the sticking points at the end of this thing is, what are we going to do with the 550 children who the Alabama authorities have kidnapped and thrown in jail and are ransoming, call it bail, for $250,000? We don't have $250,000. Who paid it? The UAW, the Packing House Workers, and finally we can give a little hats off to the AFL side of the room, George Meany. He gives this $80,000, and also just another hats off, our friend Harry Belafonte. Deo, right? Daylight come, he wants to go. 250,000. This created the movement, folks. Before Birmingham, 4% of Americans thought civil rights was the country's most pressing issue. After Birmingham, 52%. The Freedom Rides earlier, 1,200 activists. Birmingham, 100,000. 15,000 arrests. In the period after Birmingham, 786 cities. 14,000 more, 15,000 more, 758 demonstrations, 186 cities, 15,000 more arrests between May and August 1963. This is a mass movement now. The question is how are we going to take advantage of it? Well, out here in California, a civil rights movement is going on, and protests are in sympathy with Birmingham happen. Tens of thousands show up in San Francisco in a big rally sponsored by the International Longshore Workers Union, Harry Bridges, and all of that. The Great Detroit March, where he first delivers the speech, I Have a Dream speech, to a huge crowd, some 200,000 in this march. And then, of course, finally, in August of 1963, we see the March on Washington with the big six. There's Walter Reuther of the UAW, President Kennedy, A. Philip Randolph right there, King. The March for Jobs and Freedom. Who printed up the buttons? Who printed up the signs? Who paid for the buses? This is the union movement. There's that nasty side to it, but there's also this incredible, wonderful side to the story of the labor movement in the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement in the labor movement. And I think sometimes when we think about what our own unions do, we need to maybe look back at this and try to think, okay, well, which side are we on particular issues, and so on. When we get to the Civil Rights Act of Barry Rustin was behind it. By the way, none of this stuff was popular. Everybody was always told they're doing it wrong. You're not doing it right. And today, when people go out on protest, they say, you're not doing it like King did. See, King was popular. Was he? No. Look at this. 23% thought it was a good idea to have the March on Washington before the March on Washington. Right? After all, if it's popular, you wouldn't need the march. Right? It's March for Jobs and Justice. All right. I'm going to wrap up here. You can see 150 slides is too much for a 1 hour and 5 minute kind of thing, 1 hour and 10 minutes. But you get a sense of it here. I love all these pictures. Those are printed up. Those are not handmade signs. Right? There's Rustin, the guy responsible for organizing this almost more than anybody else. John Lewis, and of course, King in his big speech. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act, outlawing for the first time at the national level discrimination at work, along lines of race, national origin, religion, or sex. You can't discriminate anymore, they say. But I think the story of the civil rights movement should tell you that it takes a movement to create something like that. It probably will still take a movement to make sure it's enforced. And I think that's one of the things that maybe some of us have lost sight of, that you got to keep going. There are no permanent victories. The fact, for instance, that the word sex was put into that law as a joke to try to sink the law. A Southern senator put it in, saying, a Southern congressman put it in, basically saying, well, everybody knows you should discriminate against women. And so therefore he put sex in there, hoping that some of the pro-civil rights folks would say, well, we can't pass it like that. Well, when that word's in there kind of as a joke, you know you're going to need a feminist movement to back up the enforcement of that. I mean, it's the 1-2 punch. It's the 1-2 punch. Right? And then, of course, King's last campaign, as Dan mentioned at the beginning today, King's last campaign was defending workers in Memphis, Tennessee, 2 of whom had been killed in a trash compactor. And then they went out on strike, and it became a massive, this is the Poor People's Campaign, going for an economic bill of rights. But it became a massive movement in Memphis. King went down there, and that is where he was killed, in support of workers, against the National Guard, against the entire organized police force of Memphis. You've probably seen that picture. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will be only an initial act. One day, we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed, so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their way on life's journey, on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It is not haphazard and superficial. It comes to see that the edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. I love that line, and I'm of a mind that that is one of the reasons why King was killed. It's that kind of revolutionary idea that I think really, it just shows you what a labor movement and a civil rights movement, an economic justice and a racial justice movement can do together. And that's a threat, or is still a threat to the powers that be. And so I'll just leave it there. I'm sorry I went 10 minutes over. I apologize. And I've got 100 more slides, but anyway, that's if we want to have questions and answers, or we're getting 10 minutes in, we want to have lunch, or do we want to have questions and answers during lunch?
Yeah, so it's a good call. I think food and this room is open for the next hour, so I'd love for there to be a lively discussion. I do want to give folks that have other places to go the opportunity to grab food and exit, but this is an opportunity to network. I do, and then Judy wants to take a group photo. I just question, how many folks learned something new today? How many folks feel moved by what you heard? How many folks feel powerful? Let's emulate the folks that laid the groundwork before us. For all the students in here trying to figure out what you're going to do in life or studying different things, we're all workers. Grand majority of the country are workers. There are small business owners, etc. But we are all future worker leaders if you want to be. The labor movement has gone through a time of immense shrinking and some staggering kind of losses. But we are at the renaissance of the labor movement, and it's time to grow. So I'd encourage you all to link up, be together, fight for your rights wherever you're at. Join a union, form a union, do whatever you can, and fight for each other across racial lines for solidarity for all the things that we need to change in our country. So I'll leave it at that. Feel free to grab food, ask questions. Really want to thank our professors again for their amazing contributions.